Yeah.
Yes, sir. We can start.
Yeah. Thanks, Joel. So, good morning, everyone, and welcome again to the third day of the thesis symposium. This is the thesis. These are thesis presentations and discussions on the final year uh, uh, projects of our students, and one of the aims in this of this course is to uh, develop an argument on space, around space. And one of the things that we have been experimenting since last couple of years is the dimension of how do you make arguments through drawings. Because when I say drawing, I also mean texts and many other forms of working with different mediums. So we've been trying to do that. Of course, it will take more years to kind of consolidate and settle it, but again, the methods are work in progress. This morning we have 3 presentations, and all 3 are interested in the question of how practice kind of starts shaping, making space. How practices in everyday life, or practices of routine, or practices of work, or practices of enterprise, how do they shape and make or create a sense of space? And we have presentations from households, from journeys and movements, and from institutions. And the key over here is in all 3 cases, you'll find that certain practices over a prolonged period of time, how they kind of reconfigure and create a possibility to appropriate a configuration of space which is otherwise kind of produced for a certain dormant kind of, a certain institution, or a certain function, or a certain specific aspect. So that's what these 3 presentations are going to talk about. My name is Pracheta Shetty, and I work at the School of Environment and Architecture. The three presenters are Pracheta Sawardekar, Chinmay Gandhi, and Yamini Patil. And we have 2 scholars responding to these presentations, and they will be with us through the day for responding. Dr. Patel, he's been a good friend of C, and Kush currently works with Srishti School of Design. Kush's work has been around the question of difference, caste, class, gender, and the questions of justice have been very important. Spatial justice has been very important for Kush. And I think the pedagogical experiments has been some of the methods that were being explored. I have put the detailed biographies, not detailed, brief biographies on the chat box, so one can kind of read them. But I think uh, when we met Kush for the first time in Calicut, uh, in a school which was like all architecture schools, which was which kind of looked at architecture as a product of a certain patronage, and then architect as a supplier of a built form. Kush's pedagogical experiments were about smudging, these specific relationships that were otherwise dominant in architectural thinking, and work through ways in which communities, people across diversities can become agencies to kind of think and make and create space. And I think those are very significant experiences, significant explorations and experiments to shift pedagogical agendas which were otherwise kind of ossified in architectural education. We have another doctor in the panel, Dr. Prasad Khanolkar. So and Prasad has been a very, very old friend and a joint conspirator in many of the things that I did. Prasad is an architect also, and currently works at IIT Guwahati. Prasad's work is also important in the ways that I spoke about Kush's work, but the nuances of every day becomes so explicit in Prasad's work, and his new coming book and the new work that he's working is expected to kind of make a seminal intervention in shifting and changing the way places have been thought about in urban studies. And I think there Prasad's engagement with processes of life and the energies of life and the way they kind of make cities and places and structure societies for us. I think those are important dimensions Prasad will add as a scholar to urban studies in India. So welcome both of you, and looking forward to hear from both of you as responses, but also to kind of hold a prolonged conversation in these presentations, but also continue the conversations later with the school, and we keep inviting Prasad and Kush and Sarovar and Vishwanath and a few other very special friends of the school, often to kind of reflect with and have conversations with. I think it's a way of growing up together. So with that, I'll invite the three presenters. Y'all can be very calm and chilled. Pracheta is looking very serious. Pracheta is looking very, very calm and chilled. And I know Pracheta tells stories in amazing, unassuming ways. So please compose yourself with stories. So it's very nice. So we'll start with Pracheta in the morning, and Pracheta speaks about houses and homes and how work, enterprise, particularly within the house, kind of starts reappropriating the apartment, so to say. Pracheta.
Yeah. Can you see my screen?
Yes, Pracheta. Go ahead, please.
Yeah. Hi, a very good morning to all of you. My name is Pracheta Sawardekar and my thesis topic is negotiation of live work. As we all know, the Industrial Revolution led to functional specialization of labor, resulting in a sharp separation between living and working conditions within urban spaces. In order to achieve increased production and efficiency, such societal growth necessitated zonal segregation. This manifests itself in the spatial division of home and workspaces, which are imagined as spaces for singular activities. However, in many contexts like ours, spaces are not lived so singularly. Rather, people actively use their living spaces for their own micro enterprises. In order to achieve this, inhabitants of the home have to make certain arrangements or spatial reconfigurations to conduct their work in the same place. Such reconfiguration challenges the normalized and consolidated type of living, which is only thought through the registers of bedrooms and living spaces. Thus, my research question is, how do conditions of work and living shape and redefine the boundaries of private and public spaces within a house form? To further understand the above relationship, residents were interviewed and asked following questions. What kind of businesses do you undertake to support your family financially? How do you maintain the difference between the domestic schedule versus the working schedule? Are they separated by the given allotted time or happen simultaneously at the same interval of time? How did you modify and transform the house while planning the space in terms of working conditions? Where it was further understood that how the overlapping and multiplicities begin to occur within the house for the study, which included how the user enters the live workspace. It is also differentiated by how someone who works in the space travels through the unit as opposed to someone who actually resides there. As the scale of the house built form becomes larger in terms of verticality or the extension of the house, the separation between the live work spaces becomes more defined. In small scales where there is a limited space, the live work spaces may not be considered by any physical object, but is instead separated by time. The balance between live work depends upon the amount of live space in relation to the amount of workspace. So further going into the field work, where the first case is of apartment type, which is considered to be a live-in unit, where in this typology, living and working take place in the same space, entirely overlapping and demarcating lines which can be adjusted or changed on a daily basis. The first type is of apartment as a tailoring enterprise and tuition class. Mrs. Fad- Mrs. Fadke is a retired employee who lives with Palak and Payal. Their residence is a 1 BHK flat. Mrs. Fadke does her domestic chores in the kitchen and watches television in the living room. Palak occupies the bedroom because of her online classes. Uh, Whereas Payal plays with her grandmother in the living room while watching television. Palak uses the bedroom for her studies while her grandmother uses it for beading work, and the living room is utilized for tuition classes and stitching, where the house radically transforms its patterns to accommodate work conditions in the built form. Similarly, in the next apartment type, Mrs. Gandhi is a housewife and has two sons, Chinmay and Saurabh. Mrs. Gandhi spends her leisure time watching TV and doing household works, while the two sons occupy the bedroom for their studies and for resting. In the working conditions, then the house completely changes its patterns by adjusting the activities of tailoring, where Mrs. Gandhi sits near the TV unit where she cuts her clothes on the cutting table because she can easily get access for the clothes which are kept in the cupboard below the TV unit, where the bedroom is also converted as a storage space for her where she keeps her clothes after they are stitched. The next case is of chawl, which is considered to be a linear unit where there are two independent spaces with either having street-facing veranda or just a veranda outside the built form. The first example involves a chawl as a catering business in which Mr. Gavkar works as a caterer. Their home is a one-room hall kitchen with an extended veranda in front. His wife utilizes the kitchen to conduct her household chores by closing the curtains and separating herself from the clients who come to place their meal orders, while Mr. Gavkar relaxes in the living room where also his daughter sits to study. Simultaneously, the curtains between the kitchen and the living area is pulled open in the working conditions, and the central space of the living room is utilized for cutting and preparing the vegetables by putting another stove in the living room by also further extending the activities in the veranda. In a chawl, as a vada pav business, Mrs. Joshi is a housewife. Mrs. Joshi does her household work while her children and husband study and watches television in the living room. When it comes to working conditions, the environment is radically transformed with various multiplicities of work, such as Mrs. Joshi slices potatoes while simultaneously preparing bhaji with her daughter seated in the living room. Then there's an extra space on the left side of her house that she uses to sell vada pavs because the veranda opens into a street where clients stand and wait for their orders. The last case is of row houses, which are considered to be the live adjacent units, which are either adjacent to one another or above and below each other. Mr. Halmukhe is a chartered accountant. Their residence is a one-story row house with one bedroom on the ground floor and a guest room for their relatives on the first floor. Mr. Halmukhe used to work on the upper floor for his office job before the transformation when the house was just used for domestic purposes. The lady of the house mostly used the lower level where she cooks in the kitchen while completing her domestic chores while watching TV. The lockdown, on the other hand, resulted in devising the idea of establishing a business in their home and working from there. As a result, their first floor was rapidly transformed into a CA office with the sofas put in the passage as a customer waiting area. By changing the into Mr. Halmukhe's cabin and the living room into a staff room where the employees execute their work. Similarly, in the next case of a row house as a clinic cum hospital, Mr. Lakhani is a doctor. Before the pandemic, the house was a single-storied house meant for only living conditions. Due to the pandemic, the owner of the house, Dr. Lakhani, thought of establishing an admitting ward inside the living conditions. So the ground floor was quickly converted into a clinic cum hospital with two distinct entrances for living and working conditions. The upper level was eventually built to accommodate the living conditions while maintaining the privacy between live and work. So to finally conclude, there are various overlapping happening through the multiplicities which are getting created by live work to analyze the live work patterns of housing, which has broadly four characteristics directly or indirectly affecting the live work typology. Flexibility. Flexibility is defined as the ability to adjust to new, varied, or changing conditions according to the dictionary. Flexibility analysis becomes more significant when there is less space available and the activities are more diversified in nature and features. Where home-based professions aim to fit their workspace into their living area so that multiple activities can take place which was not designed for it. Flexibility becomes a crucial factor in the housing to operate the live-work conditions smoothly. The degree of flexibility in the unit is determined by the rate of change or alteration where, especially in the apartment typology, people don't really get bothered by the walls as designed for them. They make their own boundaries by new arrangement of objects and people. Thus, it's not actually flexible from the beginning, but by overlooking the existing boundaries, people living in these spaces make it work for them. Second, dominant function. When one place has a higher need for work than another, one space automatically becomes dominant over the other by overlapping the majority of daily activities. As a result, various agreements are made based on the individual user in order to maintain the balance between the two. Hierarchy of spaces, public and private spaces. When a work environment is present in a home, it is crucial to analyze the relationship between the workspace and living space division in terms of space hierarchy, because it is difficult for residents to determine which space is more important in terms of work and live, especially if work consumes a significant portion of daily activities. When working from home, there will always be a crowd of individuals in the house doing different things at the same time in the same place. It differs significantly from a single purpose structure designed solely for working or dwelling. Spatial relation between live workspaces. As discussed earlier in the fieldwork, when living and working take place at the same time, both activities have an impact on the space functionality. As a result, it's critical to understand the required degrees of separation. Live work can take place in the same area or on different floors, but they can be in the same space where they intersect with each other. But nowadays, when a client asks an architect, developer, or builder to create a house for them, the first thought that comes to our mind is restrictive planning, such as in the case of apartments, which are affordable and which are meant for affordance and simply to build. They often miss the fact that the user's requirements for accommodating their own home vary depending on their lifestyle and necessity, and thus making it inflexible and limited to only living activities to accommodate and function during the planning processes. This research can help architects in further developing techniques for planning where living and working spaces coexist within a housing unit by examining how the user tries to adapt the space to make it flexible and suitable for himself. Thank you.
Thanks, Pracheta. Thanks. I think the awkwardity, of the agility of life and the stiffness of built form. I think that will be prevalent in all three presentations. The awkwardity that gets produced by, and it's not only built form, but all forms that try to stabilize and try to bring some balance, some equilibrium into the everyday, and the way we negotiate. I'm not talking in binary terms also, but I think that overlap, because both of them are not stable historically. Like the built form has also evolved over time and currently consolidated through a certain building making process. So you find the built form, which has been consolidated through a certain political economy and building making process, and you'll see the same political economy also producing a certain life and the same, and also individual energies and aspirations and desires overlapping, and that agility of life and the fixity of the built form, when they overlap with each other, that awkwardity is something which I think it will come through. It came through Pracheta's presentation, but also it will come through the other presentations also. So I invite Chinmay Gandhi. Chinmay?
Yes. Am I audible, Prasad?
Yes.
I'll just present my screen. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
So good morning, everyone. My name is Chinmay Gandhi, and my thesis topic is the spatialities of routine. So, this thesis investigates the connection between the routine and a physical place. It looks at how physical location correspond to the imagination and distribution of work and living within the context of industrial time by looking at the historical underpinnings of routine. The majority of the metropolitan cities rely largely on the various centralized transportation and circulation infrastructures. These circulation and movement infrastructures form a spiderweb within themselves. Every individual thoughts and method of doing things is forced by these massive infrastructures of movement and circulation. We begin to align our priorities unconsciously towards such centralized systems. Because of the forced rhythms of circulation and movements, each individual creates their own timetables, schedules that coincide with the centralized system to regulate our lives. This is what I interpret as routine. External factors create or specify the spatiality of routine, which drives us to behave in a certain way. Routines are put in a place to increase efficiency and productivity. The spaces, the spaces that result are also thought of in terms of routines that are devoid of human dimensions. Hence, my research question for this thesis is what is the relationship between the routine and the spatiality. To develop the argument further, many text, videos, and readings have been referred to arrive at this concept tree. Some of the concepts are taken from the readings, whereas some of the concepts I myself derived to develop the argument. One of the important concepts is the industrial time, as it has introduced the concept of routines, timetable, schedule within itself. Other important concepts are antagonism, which is the feeling of weight, intimacy, interaction, recreation, and so on. In order to analyze the space of routine, two institutional locations were thoroughly examined, which are ward office and local bank branch. Ward offices were used as case studies to demonstrate how routines are manifested in their spatiality. These are excessively bureaucratic spaces that are designed solely for the administrative purpose, removing the human dimension from the planning processes. Ward offices are structured in such a way that it is tough for the user to organize themselves over the entire place. A local bank branch is used as an example in another case study. The, the areas in the banks are classified in such a way that the classification of spaces becomes the key trace of routine for the both employees and the users. For the drawing method, I refer to drawing of Tyler Kim, where he tries to show the water parliament of the Bangkok city through the different frames with the help of orthographic drawings. In the same way, I have derived my own drawing strategy where I've tried to show the routine of the employees with the help of orthographic drawings and collaged it according to the movement of the individual. These are the actual sites of the ward office and the local bank branch, and these are some of the site photos which helped me to develop my argument further. So, for the field study, the first interview I've taken is of the junior officer of the building department of the ward office. The office space provided to him is actually spacious, but it still feels cramped because of the placement of the storage and logistical units in the office. As a result, he tries to explore different spaces in the office. One of those spaces is the small space between the two corridors of the office, where he does most of the work, like meeting clients, other officers, and signing papers, and so on. Sometimes he gets exhausted because of the work pressure, so he goes to the backyard sitting in the office, which allows him to get out of the stress of the work. The second interview I've taken is of the officer of the assessment department. Earlier, he used to come to the office according to his own schedule, which is a bit late. But since the fingerprint has been introduced, he has to come to office forcefully on time. Otherwise, he would mark absent on that day. Also, the office cabin, which is provided to him, is not ventilated. Also, it is a small, so he does not like to work in that space. Therefore, he meets the users or the other officers at the entry of the offices where he feels convenient to talk about certain things. He often goes to the garden which is near the entry of the ward office just to relax and have some relief for some time. Third interview for I've taken is of the officer of the maintenance department. The office space provided to him is not maintained for many years, so it has become dark and dingy. Therefore, he does most of his work in the corridor of the office, or sometime he goes to the backyard sitting, as he can sit and work there at the same time, and also it allows him to have relief for some time. The fourth interview I've taken is of the head manager of the ward office. Earl- Earlier, the cabin which has been provided in the office was very much spacious and very well ventilated, as compared to the space which has been provided now. The current cabin is at the corner of the office and it is totally disconnected from the other officers of the office. So he feels alone in the office. As a result, he goes to the shared spaces like canteen of the office where he is around many people. He also works and have lunch or breakfast at the same time. He often visits a small katta near the entry of the ward office, where in the break time he meets other officers and have some fun. The fifth interview I've taken is of the FD department officer of the bank. He is in contact with most of the users and throughout the day, and many users ask unusual questions at times, which becomes irritating to him. Therefore, he goes to the meeting room when there are less clients and when there is no one to disturb him in his work. He often visits the ground floor of the apartment to get out of the hectic routine. The sixth interview I've taken is of the passbook updater of the bank. Since COVID, a separate passbook printing machine has been provided to the users. Still, the most of the user goes to him with various complaints. As a result, he tries to neglect his own work and start working with the other officers in the office. Often, he sits in the locker room to get out of the anger of the users as he can yell at them according to him. The last interview I've taken is of the bank manager. He is an extrovert guy who likes to be around the people. But as the senior authority of the bank, he's provided a separate cabin in the corner of the office where he does not like to work. As a result, he tries to place many shared or the public spaces. For example, the chai tapri near the office or the front open space of the apartment where the actual bank is. So for the conclusion, I began to comprehend the routine of the bureaucratic spaces as a result of my observations and interactions. Bureaucratic spaces are often thought of insular spaces without consideration of human dimension in mind. The spaces are designed as confined square boxes with no room for social interaction. Because the setting does not allow for social interaction, the employee who work there have a sense of confinement. Due to the limitations of space, there is a lack of work sharing, which leads to the increased stress and separation of work and ordinary life. As a result, mundane office work becomes othering as the employee seeks to avoid it. Employees try to find alternative locations in the office that allow them to interact with one another while still allowing them to work quickly. In workplace situations, there is a lack of sharing work-related fears, which leads to stress. As a result, individuals strive to explore new locations, which helps them to relieve tension and a sense of confinement. The spaces occupied by the users are categorized into shared spaces, in-between spaces, and vestibule spaces. Vestibule spaces are nothing but the entries of the office where people do meet their fellow colleagues or the users. The in-between spaces are nothing but the garden and backyard sitting and the tiny platform between the two corridors where people do work as well as their relief for some time. The last category is the shared spaces, which are the corridor spaces, the canteen, the tiny katta near the entry, and the chai tapri, where people generally go when they are in stress. Hence, the thesis encourages to take deeper look at the relationship between the work productivity and the space satisfaction amongst the users. Routine spaces can be reimagined in a way that they become comfortable for the work. The relationship between the work productivity and space satisfaction hence is achieved. The spaces should be imagined in a way that allows interpersonal interaction between the employees of the office and also introduce the spaces which allows them to reduce work stress. Thank you.
Thanks, Chinmay. I think methodologically, and also in terms of process of looking, going through the thesis, I think all three of them kind of are peeping into specific people's lives, and looking at them very very closely. And I think this kind of a process of accompanying somebody or peeping somebody is peeping into somebody's life, or kind of looking very, very closely at what people do through their day, etc. I think of course, I mean, one can call it voyeuristic and stuff like that, but I think what it does, what it enables us to kind of think about is the impossibility of uh, uh, bringing life into a framework, a conceptual framework. A conceptual framework would mean a certain commonality between things, a certain reputation, etc., etc., etc. But once you start going closer and working from there, you realize it's impossible to kind of hold life within specific conceptual frameworks, and then the ideas set by modernity, which is the division of functions and the anthropometrics of bodies, and all of those standards, ways of doing things. All of those things seem to be so distant and irrelevant, and it's almost forcing you to start rethinking the agendas for built form. Really forcing. When you go close, it forces you to rethink the agendas for built form and producing and imagining new space. I'll call upon Yamini Patil, who's also working with government institutions, looking very specifically at Spalities in Nashik, and has spent a lot of time there. Yamini?
Yeah, I'll present. Are you able to see my screen?
Yes, Yamini, you can go to the presentation now.
You can hear me clearly, right?
Yes.
Hello, everyone. I'm Yamini Patil, and my thesis topic is Adaptable Workspace. So in our everyday lives, we spend the majority of time at work. The sense of space in work environments influences the users and thus changes their behavior towards the surroundings. The physicality of workspaces has an impact on people, and it urges them to change their surroundings. This thesis aims to observe how users adapt to workplaces and what strategies do they adopt to feel comfortable in their work environments, in the physicality of their work environments. The trigger to look at workspaces was the newly induced condition of adapting to one's home environment to work during the post-lockdown during the COVID pandemic. The research question is, what impact do work environments have on users' behavior? How does that affect their perception of space? And what physical changes do people make in their workspaces to adapt to their environment? Talking about operative concepts, the idea of adaptation, functionality, and the behavior of users related to it affects the physical space. The concepts were studied in depth through different essays and readings. In one such essay, Margaret Bernard talks about the spatiality of spaces in which bodies are exposed to and impacted by spatial arrangements and the emotional regimes associated with them that affect one's actions. In due course, people accept these spatial arrangements and change the physical space according to their activities to increase the free flow of space for their individual comfort. Next is the methodology, that is the framework. Through the field studies, workspaces are categorized according to the evolution of space, arrangement, circulation, and function. Observations and interviews held in every office space indicates the possibility of physical change in the workspace despite their restrictive organization that is seen specifically in the government workspaces. Using the case studies of various work environments, fields were analyzed, and further the study focused on government offices. So starting with the field studies, in the first field study, different offices were observed where people mainly discussed how their work affected their mood. During the interviews, one discussed how they felt in their offices, their aspirations, and comparisons between different work environments, as well as why this has become the most important space in their lives. So, according to the interviews, the following diagram represents the possibility of the user having positive or negative thoughts throughout the changing space. By doing so, I was able to learn how space affected a user's mind and what were their experience in it. So, through this field study, I selected government offices, specifically looking at the agriculture department. So, this is the first case study. This is the agriculture department and also a training center. The agriculture department is housed in an old building with an outdated layout, but it is well maintained by landscaping. The plans show the partition, circulation of public, arrangement of the furniture, the desks, partitions, through the cupboards, which locates the workspace of the users. Starting with Mr. Shilanath's story, he begins by explaining the landscaping done on his campus, which was his idea because he believes having a pleasant environment helps one work efficiently. As I visited the office 2 or 3 times, his desk was always neat and organized. Sometimes it was even empty because his files were kept in the cabinet he had installed when he moved into the cabin. Due to the congested nature of the office, the door was always left open. The employee stated that no matter where he was posted, he always keeps his desk clean, keeps the windows open, and keeps a small plant on his desk. All of his files are organized daily. It is important for him to have a comfortable, clean, and well ventilated workspace, as well as to have good relations with his colleagues. So, this is the comparative study of the adjacent cabins. A similar layout can also be found in the office opposite to this one. Despite keeping the doors and windows open, the space appears cluttered. There is no room in the office for another person besides the two officers. Comparing the two cabins to see how the same space can be transformed results in a space that is both spacious and cluttered according to its functionality, according to its use, depending on the users. So next field studies. The Agriculture Technology Management Center is also part of that training center. Here, the lady, Mrs. Vandana Shinde, works at the same training center, but this department is located in the different building. So here she mentioned that her cabin is small because in the past, one whole cabin was divided into two cabins just by adding a temporary partition. The window is divided unevenly, and that's why there is less light that enters her cabin specifically. Her workspace had a large cupboard before, which she removed and replaced with a small one because it took up a lot of space. In addition to interacting, observing, working with the staff, and having these smaller transformations in her cabin, it helps her to work efficiently. The partition that creates a semi-enclosed space also allows some light to enter during a few hours of the day through the adjacent cabin. Mrs. Shinde also always keeps the door open so that she can observe the outside surroundings. In the right sketch, you can see that she has the best view from her desk since she can see the whole row of employees, her colleagues, and even the main entrance through which other people enter. Here also, we are comparing the two adjacent cabins. It has two windows and is bigger than Mrs. Shinde's workspace. Even the officer in that cabin removed the cupboard to make the space seem larger, even if it was still larger than Mrs. Shinde's cabin. Next is the Citizen Facilitation Center. The center was located in a big hall in the municipal corporation with basic partitions and an arrangement for the booth for certificates. It had 3 semi-enclosed cabins where we got certificates and then other desks arranged in the hall. Here I talked to Mrs. Manisha Zada, who had worked in the same space for the last 3 years. She mentioned the constant interaction with the public and how it becomes tiring as the outsiders enter the office whenever they have any queries, and it disturbs her other work as the certificate booths are just near the main door. Despite the cabin being compact, Mrs. Zada hired 2 girls to assist her in order to reduce the amount of multitasking. She mentioned that she never left the cabin during the lunch break because she felt responsible for the money that they had in their storage space. In fact, she added another desk where she kept her personal stuff, worked on the finances, and had her lunch alone for all the 3 years. As the space is small but has some privacy and also storage spaces, she never left the cabin. But in the next uh, cabin, in the adjacent cabin during the lockdown, another staff member from the neighboring cabin shifted to the outside space as he never felt comfortable in that small cabin, and he even removed some furniture from it, which reduced the clutter. The fourth case study is of the town planning office in the municipal corporation. Organization and circulation affect the users in different ways, because of which they have occupied and transformed the space according to them, and hence the space has evolved over the period of time. So here, this is Mr. Ahir's table. He mentioned that it gives you some sense of privacy and it is also well ventilated, but then as his job demands him to interact with people and guide them, he keeps on meeting different kinds of people over the day. He likes to examine a person before that person even enters his cabin. There was a partition that created a lobby when a person entered from the door, which Mr. Ahir removed deliberately. He keeps his door open for the maximum time as it becomes easy to interact and have a look at the people. The space has been reorganized to make it appear spacious after he took out a lot of cupboards. Following that, he pointed out that there was no CCTV desktop in his cabin, which he installed just for the purpose of having a look at the office and being responsible and keeping an eye on the other employees. As he moves every 3 years from different offices, he develops his own workspace and alertness in the office. Here in the adjacent workspace, even though the adjacent workspace is huge, the partitions, cupboards, chairs make it cluttered, and the user does not make any changes, which reveals the way the person maintains a workspace and the way they want it to be. And it even affects the public which enters it to meet the officer. So all the above observations and conversations show every individual's behavior and how they convert their surroundings into a space of comfort through these smaller transformations to the space by adding or subtracting things around. This slide shows the comparative study of office spaces, starting with the types of partitions they have in the public and open areas, where the workspace of the lower cadre of an employee includes a desk, chairs, and some storage space. During the evolution, these cupboards also act as partitions for those workspaces. On the right side, the column is of the types of cabins for the higher cadre of officers, which also evolved over the years in each of the office spaces. So conclusion, the study and exploration on field state that every human is structured in a way that they adapt to the environment by transforming its physicality. The change in settings that people do in their workspace is always according to the setting of their old workspace or their aspired workspace. Through the evolution of space, utilization, and activities performed in the interiors, you can observe the interrelationship between the environment created in office spaces and its function. The above observations, comparative study, and behavioral change in people help in forming basic parameters or guidelines for a flexible and temporal workspace. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Yamini. Thanks. Thanks. That's very nice. I was thinking how the ideas of safety, the ideas of the personal, preservation of the personal, and the ideas of get transformed into concepts of permanence and privacy and property. Safety becomes permanence, a desire for permanence. Personal becomes a urge for privacy, and security becomes a kind of a compulsion for property. And if we start distilling, then permanence, privacy, and property starts kind of shaping and dominating the way we think about architecture, actually. So and space, and that's where we have landed. And what all three of these guys are saying is that another softer conceptualization may be required of safety, the personal and security, to not to kind of take it to the extreme of permanence, privacy, and property, but to kind of leave it in a state of becoming, in a state of remaining smudged, in a state of remaining unclear and stuff like that. And I think that that part of pointing out what could architecture kind of seek to do then, if the ideas of permanence, privacy, and property are forced onto life, and life kind of starts engaging with it differently, then can we kind of think about going back to the ideas of safety, personal, and security, and then kind of rethink and remake it in terms of becoming the architecture which is incomplete, which is smudged, which is unclear, etc. I'll invite Kush and Prasad to kind of respond to these three presentations, and then the presenters can respond to these responses, and then we'll open it up to the rest of the audience. So who wants to go first, Kush or Prasad?
Prasad, feel free. Sure. That's fine. I can go. Okay, I'll go through, each of the students' presentation and maybe just draw up some larger questions at the end of it. So, Pracheta, firstly, I was wondering, where does the term living space come from? As if work isn't living space, like this strange idea of what is work and living. Just as a historical term, I wasn't, that's not a question to you, but I was wondering for myself, where this idea of living as a concept for a space comes in, right? Something that is separate from work. But in terms of the work that you're doing, you were talking about flexibility as an architectural strategy, right? A certain ability to keep moving. Right? And it's sort of a word for a time where one has to keep moving jobs, take on different roles. You have to do multiple jobs in one day, occupy multiple roles in one day. Right? But as an architectural strategy, and if you could expand the idea of flexibility, right, to certain architectural acts that you see happening in the houses that you're studying, right? For example, there was one which was this idea of, and this I'm just drawing from what you were describing, where there's a sense of switching spaces, right? The spaces are constantly being switched from one to the other, and then back. So there's a switching that happens of space. Right? The other was about this expansion and reduction, right? The space gets expanded into one thing, there's a reduced as the day goes on. Then there was a certain idea of spaces which overlap, right? Or intersect with each other, right? And these are all different architectural strategies that expand the idea of what you mean by flexibility, right? And also and all of these architectural strategies or processes that are occurring in these houses in some sense what Prasad was talking about, start changing the path of the hierarchies and divisions of spaces as we know them, right? So they take on maybe newer terms, right? The idea of work and living has started to itself also move, right? We still kind of thinking about work and living, but are there new names that can be given to these kinds of spaces, right? And I say this because there was a time, or maybe it's still there, that there's we have an idea for open concept house, right? In interior, everyone, like my mother would say, like you like an open concept house or something like that. But these are architectural strategies which are very much, in some sense, required, which we don't really see in real estate today, right? The idea of a switching house, a house that keeps switching in terms of as it goes through the day, or a house that is expanding and reducing, right? And there's a whole series of, the fact that we are working in our houses, but also that work has become a part of, our life in some sense, right? It requires us to think about housing, so when Prasad yesterday is talking about what the state policies can be, but not state policies per se, but, thinking about a shift in the idea of the apartment itself, right? An apartment that is switching or, expanding and reducing. I mean, these are good architecture strategies to think about the concept of an apartment type or a row house or however. So just the idea of, paying attention to these, what flexibility actually involves as an architectural act, right? For Chinmay, if I was sort of missing a sense of routine, right, in the presentation. And when I say routine, is that the person you follow, you kind of follow their routine, but their routine is also located within a larger sense of a routine of work, right? And the kind of offices in which they are. So, that person is one of the person along with other people, right? They have clients, people who come into the bank, people who come into the ward office. And so the person's routine is always changing, or, the kind of space they occupy is in relationship to the other people's routines also, right? Who is coming at what point of day. So in that sense, it almost, if I was to take a step back from that individual's routine, it almost seemed like this game, right? Where one person is trying to move where the others move, or move away from where the public is, occupy a certain what you call an in-between space, because the others come at that point, right? So there's a sense of routine of others, and the one person's routine also somewhere it intersects, it kind of, changes path from that. And so in that drawing, how do you sort of draw that, intersections of routines and sort of departures of routine, right? And I say this because, like routine, in some sense, also as a form of, and this goes to a larger question, is how do you, think about routine as a form of drawing itself, right? Like, how do you, because when I was doing architecture, I think we would started off with tracing, right? You sort of keep on tracing the drawing over and over again until, you keep changing certain parts, right? And I was wondering if the digital format sort of changes that idea of the routine of drawing, where you see what is there and keep working on that layer, right? But how do you sort of draw out a routine in a drawing, right? Because right now I get one snapshot of it, but a routine has a sense of, circularity, right? And the break, what you call the in-between, is sort of a break from that everydayness in the circulation, right? So one is circulating in that space, but also to move away from it, right? But sometimes, moving away also becomes routine. So, these are things that, you want to expand on, sort of, develop through a drawing, as a way of exploring what is happening to the routine in the space, right? If you keep drawing, say, every day one drawing of the same routine, does it become something else at certain point? So to also imbibe what you're studying in some sense as a way of exploring what you're studying, right? So how do you sort of mimic what you're seeing and what you're studying as a way of also exploring where is the break in that routine, right? Because that is what you're trying to also capture. So, where does the connections of routine happen? Where the connections happen? What kind of space is it disconnect? And you have that,
Prasad,
right, in your drawings at this point.
Sorry,
the connection was bad.
I missed the part in between. You're
The last two
something.
sentences. The last two sentences.
Okay. No, I was saying that, is actually, I mean, if you can actually explore or mimic what you're studying as a way of actually also exploring it architecturally, right, is to draw it as a routine, right? A drawing of routine, but also drawing it every day to see what is it that comes up every day, right, for you. Because routines are not circular in that sense. There's always a sense of breaking, something different that happens in everyday routines also, right? So if you're to follow the same person every day, is there some breaks that happen, in your drawings, if something comes up that changes, right? But also a sense of, there was just one question, is the bank an apartment type that got converted into a bank?
Yeah. It's a one floor of the apartment which has been converted into a bank.
So, how does that also sort of impose a layer onto these questions of, the space in some sense, right? That an apartment is become, as against the ward office, which is sort of something that is built for that, right? Also, I was looking at, are there like work routines or work manuals that they have to follow every day, if it comes up in your interviews, because the everyday routine that you're checking is also in a relationship to that they're supposed to come and do a fingerprint, right? So there's a routine also that is set up, but their routine might be a different routine compared to what they're supposed to do, right? And these are, I mean, the last two projects were interesting because they're looking at very bureaucratic spaces. Yamini, I mean, it's sort of, I kind of, the work so resonates because I work in a government school, and you're sort of given these, one storage or cupboard, one desk, and one chair, and that is what you have to work with, right? And through I've been there for 4 years, and you keep moving it from one point to the other to figure out, just the sense of a change. Because otherwise the routine becomes very routine, right? So how do you keep changing your desk from one orientation to the other? Where do you put your chair? Where does the storage go? So I've probably changed the office like 5 times to just get a sense of, but that is what you're working with in some sense, right? But the kind of concepts architecturally that you're exploring is not just the adaptability of physicality or the adaptability of space, but also sense of what is probably the larger term for the symposium, which is a certain psychogrammar, right? That these are a sense of expansiveness is probably doesn't come from space expanding, but from an object, right? Or a sense of familiarity doesn't come from that you've actually been there, but certain objects and things that you're carrying, right? The guy having a flower pot or certain things, right? And so these are tensions and moods of a space, right? Which, how do you explore it in drawing, right? Like I always think of a pawn shop which will put a mirror to get that expansive sense of like a small space in some ways, but it's also a space of working in an office where there's a constant tension of having to meet other people who you work with who might necessarily not like, or the public who you're working with, who you don't really want to meet, but you want to keep an eye on, and there's a sense of privacy that is also there. At the same time, you want to, you're moving jobs and you want to have a sense of familiarity, but it's a new office, right? So I would sort of, in some ways, move or rework the idea of what adaptability means. So, expand it, think about it in terms of, what are these tensions of publicness and privacy in a government office, a sense of routine and work, a sense of an order, right? An order not just of oneself, but an order of the office, right? Because someone has to keep an eye out, and there's a CCTV camera and those kind of things, right? A question of security, but also wanting to connect with others and safety, right? A certain sense of isolation, but also wanting to have your personal space. So these are tensions that one is kind of dealing with, right? And the kind of things that you're mapping out are these spatial strategies that they use to work around these tensions, right? And this goes for everyone, which is, we tend to look for things that work, right? Like how is it adaptable or flexible, how office becomes adaptable or flexible. But in some ways, or an apartment becomes a bank, but in some ways, the form also does not always lend itself to these adaptabilities, right? So what are the ways in which a house, in some sense, pushes back against this concept of flexibility, right? In Pracheta's case, or how does the bank in some sense also push against the concept of, or a bank space push against the concept of having a break from the routine, or the sense of an office. So it is not just to look at what is working, but also the fact that certain typologies don't lend themselves to things, right? And so those also need to be paid attention to in the work. But largely, the large question was just to, kind of explore, because a lot of these projects are also about the idea of life, right? Not just life in the sense of living in the work, but life in the sense of, living in the space of work, right? Which is beyond just doing activities, it's a sense of openness, wanting a sense of privacy, isolation, meeting, right? And these are, how do you explore, these sense of mood or, emotions in a drawing in some ways, right? Does the drawing lend itself to exploring these? In what ways can we use drawing to actually explore these ideas? Okay, I'll stop. Thanks.
Thanks, Prasad. Very nice, actually. Very pertinent also. I'll ask Kush to kind of, comment very okay, Kush. Sorry.
No. Thanks.
It's very
Thanks,
poetic,
Prasad.
the way, yeah.
No, thank you. Thanks, Pracheta, Chinmay, and Yamini for your presentations. It's really setting us off this morning on sort of really good discussions on the question of space and deep structures. For me, I felt all three projects were engaging with, were studying what I'm calling deep interiorities. And deep interiorities of life, which is to sort of signal attention to capitalist organization of relations of production that covers spaces from the domestic to the governmental. So, that is the kind of the connecting thread that I saw in all three projects, implicitly being sort of engaged with, if not explicitly spelled out. And so if there is this idea of looking at the interior space, the conditions of an interior space, what goes into making it, what are its realities, but also not distancing it from how capitalism organizes relations of production, Then the question is for all three of you, and this is a question for all of us to sort of think about as well, what are the aesthetic, spatial, and political dimensions of this capitalist organization of labor and relations of production? So for Pracheta, you get to sort of really look at specific domestic spaces and their typologies, from the apartment to the chawl to the row house. And it's interesting, your drawings really bring to light the kinds of boundaries that individuals and groups of people have formed for themselves, and you literally create these very distinct divisions that become worlds within worlds for the length of time that they are being occupied, either to make vada pav or to do different activities of the day and night. But my question to you is, who gets to set those boundaries? When do those boundaries get set? And how are those boundaries set? So, which is a way to sort of ask, what is the topology? What is the social? What is the architectural equivalent or an understanding of social relationships that get to be understood in and of themselves, that take precedence by virtue of gendered relations of labor as well within those domestic spaces, and how they contribute to sort of thickening those boundaries or sort of even blurring them? Or what are the resistances of the physical to even cross those boundaries? So the question is, how are the boundaries set, by whom, when, but also then to what extent are these physical typologies allowing for boundary crossings? To Chinmay, your project on spatialities of routine, it's interesting, right? That you observed, or at least your drawings had no representation of women in those spaces. And so as much as you were shadowing these workers, from junior officer all the way to bank manager, they were all men. And so if you observe no women in these workspaces, what does that say about spaces for a certain kind of sociality, which could be understood as homosociality? What does that say about the kinds of workspaces and difference that gets to be organized architecturally? And for Yamini, yours is sort of going the other end and sort of providing us a glimpse into the very gendered construction of space, right? Because your typologies lend themselves to mixed workspaces, and there were a lot of questions of how those workspaces are also being domesticated with memories, with additions, with different objects. So the question is to sort of, really invite you to articulate more, perhaps explicitly, what is the gendered construction of the spaces that you studied? And the reason I'm sort of bringing this question of gender is not because I study it in relation to space, but because I think there is a larger question of alienation. And I know, Chinmay, you did reference Henri Lefebvre in your sort of, the texts that you've looked at. And Lefebvre talks about this question of alienation. So, when you talk about everyday life, it's not just the daily life. In Lefebvrean framework, the everyday life is a deeply alienated life. Alienation, which comes from this kind of distancing that we observe, that we experience, that we are participating in because of how capitalism, questions of clock time, questions of social relationships, questions of domestic labor are constantly being organized. And so if there's a sense and a kind of a drawing of alienation in each of these projects that's coming through, which are those moments? Again, moments with a capital M. It's a very Lefebvrean concept. Moments that begin to resist these experiences of alienation. And then what role does space and architecture play in amplifying these moments that groups of people get to make and remake through their everyday life? So that's the question that I would want to pause with.
Thanks. Very nice. Very nice. I think uh, you all have set a very lovely tone to kind of, and posed the questions, on terms of the presentations, on terms of what they were doing, which is kind of, is very, very important actually. I mean, the idea of drawing, the idea of looking closely at nuances, the questions around interiorities and alienation, and how life kind of, struggles through it or works through it, and what is the role of space and all of that. Yeah. Any responses from anybody? I mean, you all can come in your own oblique ways to respond also.
Could I respond?
Yeah.
Yes, so for the Prasad's response, I agree, Prasad, with your response that there's a missing sense of routine of their actual work that they do in the office. That is the actually I missed out those parts because in the bank generally after the lunch the users are not allowed to visit the bank because their internal works are going on. So I kind of missed out those when their actual work goes on. They actually work is after the lunch because their all of the internal work goes after the work after. So I missed out that part. I tried asking the manager and FD department guy, other employees to the office, but the replies which I got was nahi hum log kaise hi normal काम चलता है because the work that they do is confidential that they can't share with me. The same case in the ward office. Actually, when I visited the ward office for the first time, it was I think the second lockdown was going on, so there were actually very less people working in the office. So the first question came to my mind is whom should I talk to because there are already very less people working and they have actually a lot of workload. So there were no people talking to me. So I somehow managed to talk some people, but since they had a lot of work pressure, so they were not entertaining me as such. मेरे साथ थोड़ा conversation नहीं हो रहा था. But when I visited the award office again after the things started opening up, then I saw that the people working in the office were मतलब staff वापस पूरा आने लगा. So the places started operating in various ways. Then I started observing the spaces which I talked about, the in-between spaces and the garden spaces. But yeah, I agree with you that there is a missing sense of that actual workload, which I'll think of now in my further process. And the second thing is the drawing of the routine, as you said. That was the main difficult part for me because I was trying so many ways to draw the routine, but then when I was drawing it, I knew that it was not working. So then I thought that I'll just draw some orthographic drawing with the different spaces of the routine that they occupy throughout the day. Then I started connecting it with the spaces of the routine. But I'll have to still work on those drawings maybe to show more spaces of the routine. The second thing, the Kush's response, the no representation of women in the office. Actually, the people, I contact, there was no, I didn't see any, women in the office. So, your response is actually helpful for me to, think for my further processes for in design, how it will apply, how the spaces will then change, nature of the spaces will change when there are women in the office at the same time. So those are my response to the. Thank you.
Thanks, Chinmay.
Can I go?
Yeah, please.
Yeah, so to respond to Kush and Prasad questions, like I was really thinking when you were making those terms and questioning me like basic. Hello, can you hear me? So basically the term live work according to me was like अभी फॉर एग्जाम्पल घर में household lady's work is not considered to be a work because it's not because it's considered to be a domestic work and which is not paid, like पैसा नहीं मिलता है उधर. And after the industrialization, there was a rapid growth of economy, and the families, started like having less income, where the meals literally started, and the pura commercial building ka concept started emerging. So, and there was certain like certain idea or thinking of persons that men are only meant to go out and work, whereas women should stay here and take care of children and also. But somewhere in today's scenarios, women are also starting to work in the domestic houses, in the houses, or in terms of jobs and etc. etc. So most of my field visits were mostly of women who were practicing their their working conditions in the house form, and to push questions where you started questioning me, where did the boundaries or specialities come. I think that according to my interviews and the field work, I came to know that it was the person's hobby, and as there was a limited space for them to to bring work conditions or to accommodate work conditions, they started adjusting and somewhat overlapping the working activities, where and basically somewhere in the chawl and row house typologies, the build form itself made a clear separation where the apartment lacks to do so between the live and work conditions. Yeah.
Thanks,
Yeah.
Pracheta. Yamini?
Yeah. So starting with Kush's comments. So when you spoke about deep interiorities of life, actually through my observations and my case studies, field visits, I was actually looking at those things only. And these capitalist organizations do restrict those lives in those spaces. And when he talks about the gender construction of space, I didn't look at those space like the spaces or the field studies to that type, the gender construction and what all things like what all changes it makes in those spaces. It will be a good start in my design actually. But then when you talk about the moments that resist these alienation, I was maybe subconsciously trying to look at those alienations through these stories and how people actually through these smaller changes try to resist these alienations and try to converse with their surroundings and the surrounding people. So yeah, these points are actually a good start for the design. And when Prasad talks about the tensions of these routines and the order of office, as he rightly talks about the government offices, how restrictive they are, and what all furniture we have in those spaces. Through this, I actually connected with what Vishwanath talked about yesterday when I was talking about semi-enclosed spaces in the cabins and the partitions, and actually through the evolution, how the evolution affects the users in those spaces. I actually connected that idea with Vishwanath's idea, like what he questioned yesterday: what are semi-enclosed spaces, or what are open spaces? Like for a ground, we talk about open spaces, but then I connected those ideas in the interiors of my spaces. Like here, what is an open space and what is the semi-enclosed space, and whether a cabin or the organization makes it like private or semi-private, all those things. So through that, I don't know if I'm answering your questions, but I just connected to those ideas. And yeah, thank you for the questions. We'll work on it. And even the drawings, I'm still in the process of showing that alienation or the routines or the changes, behavioral changes, how to show them in a drawing, or the moods of the people and the story. Thank you.
Can I say something if there is time?
Yeah, you can say something.
Yeah, so basically I live in apartment where there is my landowner. So I live near National Park where it was fully of bungalows and there was no apartment type. And as he wanted, like, as his father died and there was less income for their home, he planned for constructing apartment type. So it's very interesting and weird things which he did after doing so. So when he constructed, he started like वो builder या सब जो एक प्रोसेस ऑफ हाउस कंस्ट्रक्ट करने के लिए जितने भी पीपल्स होते हैं, he started demanding money from those people. Like for example, in the case of builder, he just said that give me three floors with interiors, well furnished interiors, well planning, and मतलब दूसरों का घर मेरे से कम अच्छा लगना चाहिए. That was his condition. And the contractor, even the contractor, and the builder was so in loss because there was so much, so high demands of him that the construction is now just pathetic. Like fittings are not, and means his aspirations are really the thing. Like for example, abhi recently there was a shortage of water. So that weird guy, what he did, he literally मतलब काट दिया water supply. And I was wondering, भाई water supply क्यों नहीं आ रहा है घर पे? And when my father went to the terrace, and he is like कि टेरेस का चाबी मेरे अलावा किसी और को नहीं मिलना चाहिए. फिर मेरे अलावा ये अपार्टमेंट में पौधे या झाड़ नहीं लगाना चाहिए. मेरे अलावा ये जगह पे कुछ होना ही नहीं चाहिए. Like and that was really the interesting fact, and I don't know, and why. So yeah,
it's interesting. I mean, this whole thing the capitalist economy kind of takes over life, but then the life force kind of urges, and this guy who's an ex-landlord cannot leave his landlordship from the place, cannot kind of see somebody else. I mean he wants to monetize the land, but still wants to have that kind of a sense of control in this in this land, and then the way it works out in everyday lives and in everyday kind of places. Yeah, Pracheta, we have time for one or two comments or insights from the.
Yeah, actually, I wanted to.
Yes, Chinmay.
Yeah, so actually, on replying on Kush's comment on the no representation of women. So actually, there were women working in the office, but the ratio of women versus the men who were in the office of both the users and the employees was like 90:10 ratio. So but the women were there in the office, but they were there in their own groups. They were limited to the office space only, their own cabins only. So for the further process, it is important me to think about. So I was talking about the in between spaces. So how the spaces open up for the women also, to encourage them to come out of their cabins to be with the other men of the offices.
Or not. I think, they may choose to socialize in ways that allows you to draw the space from the perspective and experiences of those very women who are part of that setting, right? And so I think one of the good things about sort of doing this very grounded study is to think of terms and definitions that are emerging from the bottom up, from the inside out. So for interaction space or semi-open space, they are not labels, but they are deep descriptions of life. And one quick question to Pracheta. Pracheta, is just the anecdote that you shared with us, is that why your drawings were restricted to sort of showing everything inside the four walls of that unit, and there was no sense of how that unit was positioned in relation to other units? Because if so, then the very external boundary could be thickened to sort of signal attention to these rules, norms that force a certain kind of an interiority. So just thinking out loud as well.
That's a good suggestion. Actually,
Yeah. So there was a lot of trial and errors for making those drawings, because in the field works there was certainly a morphed condition where it's becomes certainly difficult that how to show that morphed condition in the drawings as well. And why those particular drawings? Because I tried with perspective, and simultaneously I wanted to just show the whole space. How does it look while overlapping conditions? What are the hierarchy and spatial conditions? And I thought that this set of drawings would bring out those questions, or
Pracheta will take one more comment if there is somewhere from outside. Anybody? Somesh had anybody? One last comment. Anuj, you want to come in? Rupali wants to come in. Yeah.
If nobody else wants to.
Anuj was raising his hand. No. Okay. Rupali.
I just wanted to. Two reflections. One, what I think what Prasad was talking about, the drawing as routine, or the drawing, it becomes this act of drawing every day, or the drawing. So I think that's a very interesting way. Yesterday, there was Vishwanath was talking about bringing in field notes. So in the sense, and that actually is an interesting way of opening up this question of drawing that we've been talking about, right? Like, when do you draw, or how do you that one of your research, building and accruing, and at the end of it there is something else that you then bring to the discussion. So I think that's a very interesting way of opening up the drawing out that we've been thinking about, and maybe we can bring it back in the end. How do you develop this idea of a visual culture of thinking, which is not like first drawings, then something else in the middle, and then final drawings kind of come into the presentation. So I think that's a very interesting opening up. And I think the second reflection, I would say also, like what Kush sort of also brought in is a kind of, how do you think through gender? How do you, and it's not, if you're doing a gender thesis, it's not, the topic is not gender, but that becomes a frame of thinking, and then in that sense, if you do that, how do you, how do you kind of look at, say, the workplace as a inherently masculinized space, right? Like, and then how do people start in some ways, and you'll find that even the men do that, it's not really this kind of, there's a kind of domestication that happens, and then it's not so clear as in terms of, oh, it's the women who are doing this or the men who are doing this, right? But so, because otherwise the office interior, the way it gets planned, is this very, very highly masculinized space, right? Like, you have to be this is this kind of serious official space, where there are particular kinds of relationships allowed and certain kind of relationships not allowed, right? So how does then this frame completely sort of, sort of shake up the way you actually look at the space of the interior, the kind of the masculinized space that comes in through kind of a default mode of thinking of the office. So I think, again, both these frames are interesting for us to kind of also reframe some of the questions that you've been sort of, looking through. They're interesting sort of side entries into, deepening some of the questions that you're asking. So yeah, thanks for that.
Thanks. Thank you. Anuj, you want to comment quickly?
Yeah, I was just thinking of the question of agency in the workplace, the agency that an individual has in the workplace, in order to map two things. One is the extent of intervention or change that one can make to create one's own comfort zone or place, and the second is also to map the desire that one has from one's work, and how do we kind of investigate or understand that through the close understanding or reading of the changes that have been made. So yeah, I mean, those are also kind of aspects that one can kind of look at through these studies.
Thanks, Anuj. Yeah, there's so much nice responses to this three works, and I wish we had more time to listen to Pracheta's stories. Actually, she's wonderful when she starts off, actually, and she takes off. So thanks, Yamini, Chinmay, Pracheta. We'll meet again in another 15 minutes. I think we overshot by 15 minutes in this session. Short tea break, and we assemble again at 11. Thanks.
Thank you.